Hey YouTube, it's David from mdbootstrap.com. In this video I'm gonna show you 15 JavaScript mistakes which I see often, or actually too often, when I'm doing a code review. Regardless whether we are talking about the junior, mid or senior developers, I see these errors everywhere, and in this video I'm gonna show you how to avoid it and how to write this code in a proper way. I also strongly encourage you to check our other videos where you're gonna see mistakes from other languages, tips and tricks, and also tutorials from different technologies. Without further ado, let's get started. One of the most common mistakes I encounter while looking at developers' code is related to the scope of the variables. So many developers obviously use var instead of let. This doesn't look very dangerous, very risky, but it actually is. Let's have a look at this example. Obviously, we would like to use this I iterator only inside this loop. But what happens here when we use var instead? We're gonna see that we can access this I variable outside our loop. This might be very, very dangerous when it comes to more complex programs. So imagine that instead of doing a simple console log, you would use this I variable in some math operation, and you would be surprised that all of a sudden it has some random value, because obviously now it can be even more unpredictable, as now we set it to 10, but obviously that could be depend on some variable like array length or something. Now, what is the correct way? Obviously, in order to do it correctly, we would use let. Let's change this to some other letter, as this is already registered. I is already registered as global. And now let's try to see what's gonna be the value of the iterator. And we got the error, and this is obviously expected. This is something which we would like to get, because we cannot, J is actually not defined outside this scope. Now, just to make this clear, obviously the same applies to function scope. So if we have some functions inside, so if we have some variables inside our function, we should also obviously use let, as most probably we want to use them only inside our function, and we don't want them to interfere with some other variables outside the function. And by the way, I'm not sure if you knew that, but even brackets close the scope of the variable. So if we do let x equals 5, and then we do console.log, we gonna get an error. The other important thing to keep in mind is that undeclared variable by default become global. So this is global by default, unless we're gonna use a strict mode. So in a strict mode, undeclared variables are not automatically global. So this is one of the reasons which you, actually one of the many reasons why you should always use a strict mode. Another very common mistake is related to comparing float numbers. So let's have a look at this example. Obviously, this simple math for human is, well, very easy to do, and we would expect to see something like 0.9. But let's see what's gonna happen if we do this in JavaScript, or actually in any language. As you can see, this is not exactly what we would expect to see. And obviously, you can imagine a situation where you would like to compare these two numbers, verify whether the transaction amount was correct, and you would just try to sum up this one and check whether this equals to, for example, amount of the transfer you received, and then you would get a false. As I mentioned, this is not related strictly to JavaScript. It is related in general to computers, and we can see that on this example. So as you can see, this problem is caused by fractions, and the fact that computer can't really store the exact amount, and it all depends on the precision, because if we change precision, you can see that the result changes as well. So depending on the precision, our result are different. So how can you avoid this in JavaScript? You could try and do something like this, but it's also not gonna work. It's gonna give us falsy result. So there are a few ways we could solve this. So the first option is to compare float numbers with precision. So let's have a look at this example. Let precision equals to very small number. And now if math, I'm gonna use math apps 0.3 plus 0.6 minus 0.9 is lower or greater than our precision, then obviously we have, and else we will have false. Let's test it. Let's fix it. And as you can see, this gives us true. So this is option 1. Option 2 is to round and use sparse float. So option 2, and this is option 1. So we could do something like math round sparse float 0.3 plus 0.6. This is the precision we want to use, multiplied by 100 and then divide by 100. This is a little bit tricky, but as you're gonna see, it's working like a charm. And finally, the third option is to use a dedicated library. So you could use decimal JS, which has been designed and created to handle such a cases. So it can do much more than that, but looking at the following example, like this one, 0.3 minus 0.1 give you that result. However, if you use and define this as a decimal, x as a decimal with the value 0.3 and then do the math, it's gonna give you a correct result. By the way, in ES6 you're also gonna find something called number epsilon, which is exactly meant for comparing such a number. So this is kind of a precision we used here, and this is meant to use when you compare these two numbers, which is very, very, very similar. Like this one is very close to 0.9, so you could use this number dot epsilon instead of defining this by yourself. Pardon my interruptions for a moment. I just wanted to let you know that besides this video, we also released a lot of different tutorials. Especially you should check our Bootstrap 5 crash course, which we released recently. If you want to watch this video, you're gonna find the link somewhere over here or in the description down below. This is a perfect tutorial for the people who haven't used Bootstrap 5 or Bootstrap at all in the past, as well as for those who've been using Bootstrap for some previous projects and would like to know what has changed. And believe me, a lot has changed in newest Bootstrap 5. This video and this tutorial obviously is completely free for everyone. It's available on the YouTube, and if you would like to support us to help us creating more tutorials and materials like this video and the Bootstrap 5 course, you should also try our MDB UI kit, which is available also for free as an open source. You're gonna find a link to this project down below, so give a try and I'm sure you're gonna love it. The next mistake is quite tricky. In JavaScript, array is an object. Therefore, technically, you could use named indexes, but this is not necessarily always a good idea. If you use name indexes, JavaScript will redefine the array to a standard object. After that, some array methods and properties will produce an incorrect result. Let's have a look at the example. So, although technically it will work, and I can call my array calling name index, and I'm gonna get the value I want, I won't be able to call this using numeric index anymore, and for example, I'm not gonna get a proper length of the value, while obviously when we use numeric values, we can still get what we expect from an array methods and properties. Very often I see a lot of confusion regarding none, which stands for not a number. As you can see, this confusion doesn't come from nowhere. If we try to compare not a number to not a number, JavaScript will tell us that it isn't exactly the same. So what's a good way to handle not a number? Well, there are two ways. However, it's also a bit tricky because we have two functions. We have isNone, which comes from number, and we have just isNone. So we could technically use both. Let's have a look at this example. isNone, which will return true, and number is none, which also give us true. So what's the difference? isNone returns whether the provider value equals not a number. So is not a number just checks whether the passed value is not a number or cannot be converted into a number. On the other hand, number is none only checks if the value is equal to none. It uses a different algorithm. So what's the real difference? Let's have a look at this example. When we use number is none, which is a more robust version of the original global is none against ponyfoo string, we get false because it first checks whether the passed value is type of number and equals to none. On the other hand, global is none function doesn't change the type, so it returns true. You can also see this difference using undefined. So if we're gonna use is none for undefined, we're gonna get true, but if we're gonna use number is none on undefined, we're gonna get false. Another very tricky and easy to make mistake is using variable as a key in our objects. So as you might know, you can use variable as a key in our object. So let's have a look at this example. So we want our key, we want to use this variable to define this key. So we want this key to be entity name. So we define this in a variable, and then we defined our object. Now, when we call this object, we would expect something like entity name Harry, but instead we're gonna get n Harry. And this is because very often we forget about small, tiny thing which makes a huge difference, which are square brackets. So if we're gonna use them properly, now we're gonna see what we've been hoping for from the very beginning. The other mistake which I often see is not really related to the code itself, but to the way how people debug. So how not to console log? Let's have a look at the following example. We have 3 objects here, and usually when developers want to console all of them, they write something like this. This gives us input as below. So as you can see, we are getting 3 lines, while you could easily do the same with just a single code, which gives you as an output also a single code which you can easily expand. By the way, the art of doing or using console log properly is a totally different subject, and I'm gonna create another video which gonna be dedicated only for this fabulous function which helps us to debug our code. So we're gonna cover there how to use console table, console timer, so how to set loopers, how to trace to see where exactly error come from, and many others. If you don't want to miss that, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So hit subscribe and turn the notification on, as we're gonna release this video very soon. Another common mistake is related to the object destructuring, or in other words, to repeating the object name too often. So let's imagine an object like this animal, and imagine that you want to create a function to fit the animal. So what usually developers do, they provide an argument as the entire object to the function, and then write something like this: fit animal.name, animal.meal, animal.diet. As a result, the string becomes very long. So this obviously works. However, we can do it in a smarter and shorter way. So one way to do it is to pass to the function constructor object properties directly, and then we can use template literals to easily create the output message. The other option which we could use is to assign our properties into our object and use exactly the same way. Let's have a see how does it works. So as you can see, both functions generate exactly the same result as the first one, but they take much less characters and they are much easier to read. By the way, talking about the template literals, let's move to the next very common mistake. Although the template literals are in JavaScript for a very long time, I still see many developers concatenating strings like this. So if you ever tried to create string like this, you know how annoying it is to remember about all these spaces to make sure that your variables won't get joined with the word. So every time you add some string, you need to remember to add space at the beginning and the end. As we just talked before, even adding this object name doesn't make this code look better. It's actually even worse. So instead of taking care of all the white spaces, a good way to do it is to use mention template literals, which allows us to create strings in a much more shorter and efficient way, resulting in exactly the same result unless you make a typo like I just did. The next issue I often see is developers not using a spread syntax. Let's have a look at the following example. Given the array as follows, obviously we can add new entries using push method. And let's be clear, this solution is not bad, but once you want to add more arguments to your array, it's better to use spread syntax, like on this example. So as you can see, we can add them at the very end of the table, but what is even more important is that we can use spread syntax to shift items in our array using spread syntax, as you can see on this example. So we can just add something at the beginning and the end of our array. And as you can see, Lucy and Daisy has been added at the very end. And obviously we can do the same to add new values at the very beginning of our array, simply by adding arguments before spread syntax operator. The next issue I often see isn't related to any particular line of code, it's rather general lack of understanding or rather confusion about the equality. One of the conveniences in JavaScript is that it will automatically coerce any value being referenced in a Boolean context to a Boolean value. But there are cases where this can be confusing as it is convenient. Some of the following, for example, have been known to bite many JavaScript developers. So if you look at these examples, I'm pretty sure that it's not obvious at the very first sight that they all evaluate to true, similarly to what we just confirmed few minutes before, talking about not a number, which also can result in a lot of confusion and, even worse, a lot of mistakes in our code and applications. Number 11. Misusing the addition operator for merging an arrays. JavaScript, like all programming languages, provides a plus operator for the addition of integers and floating point numbers. But as soon as you use the operator for adding different types like a string and number, type conversions take place. The value gets concatenated instead of added, as you can see here. Let's do x equals to 1 plus 1, which obviously gives us 2. But if we do y equals 1 plus 1, we're gonna get 11, and this is obviously because of the quotes of the here, which often can cause a lot of issues in our code. While this was obviously trivial, using the addition operator for merging arrays would lead to even more unexpected results. Let's have a look at this example. So we have two arrays, and let's try to add them using plus operator. Surprisingly to some of you, the addition operator doesn't really merge the arrays. Instead, it concatenates the last element of A with the first element of B. To correctly merge JavaScript arrays, use the concat, like this example, or the spread operator, which we discussed few minutes earlier. While I don't have detailed statistics of which mistakes are most common, I still strongly feel that this could be one of the most common mistakes. JavaScript provides double equal and triple equal operators for equality checks, and you could easily interchange both of them in your code, leading to this disastrous result. Here is an example that illustrates the difference between them. The triple equals is a strict equality operator and checks the data types and the value in comparison. The double equals, on the other hand, does an equality check after doing any necessary type conversion such that both the operands have a common type. The type declaration done by double equal operator requires you to be familiar with the falsy values to prevent unexpected result. For instance, not a number, which we've seen before in action, can't be converted to a common falsy value type. So it is recommended to use a triple equality operator whenever you can. Also, it's important to note that the switch block does a strict comparison only. Number 13. Missing parameters in function calls. JavaScript functions don't check the number of arguments received, which can create a source of bugs. In a scenario where you would add a new parameter to the function declaration but not pass an argument at invocation, the parameters would be treated as undefined. Since JavaScript don't check the number of arguments, you can easily call any function without passing any arguments, which can result in errors like this one. One way to fix it is to ensure that the parameters have default value in the body, like it's shown here, in which case, even when we call a function without arguments, it will get the default values. The other option is to use a little trick which we've shown you in one of our previous videos, which allows us to implement required arguments in our function, even though JavaScript doesn't explicitly support that. So if we try to call this function without argument, we're gonna get this very descriptive error that the argument 1 is required. Now, if we call it with a single argument, we're gonna get a default value. Obviously, if we're gonna call it with both arguments, it will work as expected. And even if we pass undefined, it will still raise an error. If you want to learn more tricks like this, you must have to check our other video where we are showing top 7 the most commonly used JavaScript function, which you probably didn't know. JavaScript provides several ways of iterating over arrays. For each, classical for, and for of are some of the recommended ways. Very often I see developers using for in loops, as they are easy on the eyes, but it's generally a bad idea as they enumerate over property name of an object. In case of arrays, this means foreign loops essentially iterate over the indexes, sometimes in an arbitrary order that dissolve the purpose of an array iteration. Let's have a look at the following example. Inherited methods and prototypes are also enumerated in foreign loops, which ultimately cause slower performance. This means if you extend an array prototype to include a method, that will also be enumerated. If we check our array length, we're gonna see that it has 3 elements as expected. But if we try to iterate using for in, we're gonna see that we've got some extra element over here. Now, if we use for each, for instance, this issue won't occur. And finally, the last and also unfortunately very common mistake is a failure to use a strict mode. Here are some key benefits of using strict mode. This definitely makes your debugging easier. Code errors that would otherwise have been ignored or would have failed silently will now generate an error. It prevents accidental globals, so without strict mode, assigning a value to the undeclared variable, which we've seen before, automatically creates a global variable with the name. This is one of the most common errors in JavaScript. In a strict mode, attempting to do so will throw an error. This eliminates this coercion, so without strict mode, reference to this value of a null or undefined is automatically coerced to a global. This obviously can create a lot of frustration, and in a strict mode, referencing this value of null or undefined throws an error. Then disavow duplicate property names of parameter values. Obviously, strict mode throws an error when it detects a duplicate name property in object. Then makes eval safer, and this is because there are some differences in the way eval behaves in strict mode and in non-strict mode. Most significantly, in strict mode, variables and functions declared inside of eval statement are not created in the containing scope. Finally, but not definitely lastly, it throws on individual usage on delete, so the delete operator used to remove properties from objects cannot be used on non-configurable properties of the object. Hey, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you reached so far, let me know down below in the comments whether or not you made the same mistakes or you haven't done none of that, never ever. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you want to see more videos like this, and turn on notification as we are releasing new videos like that every Tuesday and Friday. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.